Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, The Invisible Customer, How Private Equity Practices Are Changing the Biopharma Industry. Our speakers today are Lisa Pilla, President of Coaction Consulting. Lisa is a biopharmaceutical strategic advisor whose career spans over 30 years in Fortune 500 startup and independent biopharma and life science companies, and she's known for being an industry leader in commercial strategy and sales and marketing effectiveness. And I apologize for my dog barking in the background. We're also joined by Gina Mastro-Simone, an independent biopharma consultant with over 25 years of industry and advisory experience working for and with Fortune 500 companies. Her projects focus on helping organizations enhance their value through insight generation and converting implications into desired outcomes. So thank you, both of you ladies, for joining us today. My name is Ariel Atwood, and I am the Associate Director of Marketing at KMK Consulting, as well as the SME Network Manager for the KMK Star Alliance. A little bit about KMK, if you're not familiar with us. We are a commercial analytics consultancy offering integrated business critical research, analysis, and software to our pharmaceutical clients to better drive sales and impact patient outcomes. We're primarily focused in 4 areas: Salesforce effectiveness, HEOR, market research, and advanced analytics. This event is part of an educational series on current market trends sponsored by the KMK Star Alliance, which is our on-demand SME network, of which Lisa is a founding member, where you can quickly and easily engage with subject matter experts online through our website, kmkstaralliance.com. You can search through SME member profiles, the different services they offer, there's some case studies, and you can even book and pay for the services right online with a credit card. So make sure to check that out if you haven't yet. I'll add the link in the chat so that you all have it. A few quick housekeeping things. This session is being recorded and a copy will be sent out to all of the attendees after the event. During the webinar, we'll be asking a few questions to the audience where you'll see a little poll pop up and you can submit your answers through multiple choice. Feel free to submit any questions that you have for the panelists throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen with 2 little bubbles. We should have time for a few questions at the end that we can address. So let's get right into it. Lisa, I'll go ahead and start with you. The title of this webinar is very mysterious. I'm really interested to know, what exactly do you mean by the invisible customer, and why is private equity so important?
Yeah, so kudos to Gina for the mysterious title, which we thought really captured this concept of quite often there's key stakeholders behind the scenes that essentially are invisible to the biopharma company in terms of the normal engagement model, but these stakeholders are very involved in making decisions about access, interactions with pharmaceutical companies, as well as treatment selection. And we both had the opportunity about 4 years ago to we were working on a project where the project was really to assess and analyze the impact of private equity healthcare practice acquisition on biopharma engagement. And over the last 4 years, Gina and I have had an opportunity to really gain a lot more understanding of private equity companies and how they acquire healthcare practices and what the impact is on the industry, and have done a lot of work in this area. We certainly are not private equity experts by any means. We are, biopharma commercial strategy experts with a lot of experience in marketing and sales and market access. But what we have found really interesting is that private equity companies do play a big role in how healthcare practices and hospitals quite often are managed. And there's a lot of opportunity in many cases to approach and engage with these private equity companies that maybe is not obvious to everybody in the industry. So we thought we would share our learnings and provide a bit of an overview and maybe inspire some more work in this area and certainly at least more discovery. So let's get started maybe with some statistics just to talk about how big this is. So we'll put this out to those of you in the audience. What do you think is the percentage of hospitals, not practices, but hospitals that are currently owned by private equity companies? And just select your choice real quickly. All right. right, do we have the results, Ariel? Okay, so actually the majority of you picked over 50%, but a close second was 25 to 30%, which is correct. There actually was a big focus on acquiring hospitals initially, and Gina will explain a little bit why that has slowed down. And now the focus is much more on group practices that are being acquired and individual physician practices in a variety of specialties. But I think it's important to just share a couple of statistics, and you'll see this too in terms of some of the data that Gina's going to share. There were 282 hospitals in 36 states that were recently acquired by private equity companies. And there's all kinds of estimates about the investment that private equity is making in healthcare practices, and it's not always so visible. But the estimates really run as high as $1.8 trillion in terms of what private equity is investing in healthcare practices. And this has really increased significantly over the last few years, and specifically in certain specialties, which we'll cover. So for sure, it's important to understand how these private equity companies operationalize these integrated practice networks, which we'll get into and provide you with a good overview of.
It's really interesting. Those are not small numbers, right? Why exactly is this happening?
So it starts a little bit higher up with just the overall drivers of the consolidation of healthcare delivery. And, you know, what we've really summarized this and consolidated this into is these four macro trends that are driving this consolidation. There's huge pressure to improve the quality of care that is provided, but in a more efficient and economical manner. So we constantly hear about higher quality of care at a lower cost. And, you know, that all sounds great, but it's not very easy to operationalize, and it requires a significant investment in capital that only really pays off when you have a huge scale of healthcare practices. There's also a big need, in order to get that quality of care, to have much more structured and integrated care coordination and population health management. So there's a lot of population health management being applied to like CHF and diabetes and oncology. And this is spreading into chronic care models, because instead of just, you know, having an exacerbation of your underlying condition and seeking out care, the whole goal is to really manage that care much more proactively so that the outcome for patients is much better, and they're following up and getting the procedures and doing the preventative measures that are necessary to take care of their condition. And having all of their data visible and integrated so that all the healthcare providers can have that view and perspective on a particular patient. There's increased reporting and regulatory requirements. And then HCPs are really finding that not only with payers do they need more numbers and more volume in order to have power, but also with their suppliers, including, you know, pharmaceutical manufacturers. So what we're seeing is there's just much more consolidation, whether it's through private equity or through the formation of ACOs and large IDNs and so on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because we do see a lot of consolidation in healthcare delivery with the formation of bigger and bigger health systems through all these mergers that you hear about with fewer and fewer practices. So it would make sense that it would be kind of impossible to maintain any private practices in this environment. Is this model similar to a health system like an IDN or an ACO, or is it very different?
There are some similarities, but there's definitely differences. And the similarity is that you're creating a network. The network can include all kinds of healthcare facilities, whether it's an ambulatory surgery center, you know, office-based practices, hospitals, diagnostic centers, etc. The big difference is that when a private equity company acquires practices, what they do is they form a practice management company. There's a number of reasons for this. There's regulatory reasons, there's legal reasons, But there's also a big driver, which is the component of this whole model, which is if you can take all of the operational aspects and the business aspects of healthcare delivery and consolidate that, not only do you get the economies of scale, but you get much more negotiating power with payers and suppliers. And in theory, you're able to provide much more consistent delivery of healthcare. And that's where they bring in the healthcare providers into that practice management company to develop care pathways and treatment protocols that are intended to improve the quality of the healthcare delivery and have it much more consistent across the practice network, which is similar to what health systems do. But in this case, the practices that are acquired or the hospitals that are acquired, they have the opportunity to have an ownership, continue to have an ownership share in the practice network and can have an equity position, or they can choose to be an employee. Whereas in a health system, you are an employee of that health system. So there definitely are differences. And when we were talking about the invisible customer, we're really focusing on that practice management company because they're managing the overall services, and they are the ones who are making decisions about whether or not reps can enter an office, whether or not they want to stock certain drugs if it's a buy and bill type situation, which companies they want to engage with and look to form collaborations and partnerships with. So that's really the center here is the focus.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, let's get into another poll for the audience here. Let me just launch this. So we have, according to the AMA Physician Practice Benchmark Survey in 2018, which of these do you think is greater? The percentage of physicians who are employed or the percentage of physicians who own their own practices? So go ahead and put in whichever answer you think.
All right, let's take a look. Okay, so by far the overwhelming response here was the percentage of physicians who are employed, which that is correct. And actually 2016 was the first year that the percentage of physicians who are employed exceeded the percentage of physicians who own their practices. And this is just continuing to increase and is expected to increase. It's pretty close right now. It's only a difference of 40 in 2018, which is the last year the data is available for, which was just published last year by the AMA. It was a little over 45% are owners and a little over 47% are employees.
Wow. So it's all kind of coming together now, right? So we've gone over the macro trends, the buyer's perspective. Now I'm wondering, what about the position of the practice owners? What would be motivating them to sell their practices? And is there maybe a reason why they would be more inclined to sell to private equity rather than, say, a hospital or go work for a health system?
Yeah, so this goes back to the macro trends we talked about before, Ariel. And essentially what's happening is the two biggest drivers to sell are an increasing need for capital by the physician practices and the hospitals to meet the demands of the evolving U.S. healthcare delivery model. And, really what they need just to be able to invest in, equipment, in new technology, but also in all of the back office stuff. And in the individual practice, it's just never going to be able to compete with a large health system. So this is, and on the other side, there's also the need to, how can you focus on delivery of healthcare and also managing a business? In many cases, first of all, those aren't the same skills. And there's just not enough bandwidth to do both, like, in the days when a physician would hang up their shingle and, there wasn't a lot of business management involved. So when this happens, and Gina and I have interviewed tons of physician practice owners who have been faced with these decisions, and sometimes it takes them years to make these decisions because they're not the only owner. there's, partnerships, they have associates in the practice. I mean, these are major decisions. But those who skew more towards private equity are those who are much more interested in continuing to have some kind of an ownership share and some kind of a say in the practice, even if it's just for a period of time and they phase out. Quite often, those who are looking to retire but want to make sure their patients are taken care of and want to have a hand in the practice more at a higher level, but not necessarily the delivery of healthcare, will also be the ones who gravitate more towards private equity. Those who are earlier in their career looking to build their practice, they're more likely to go and be employed by a health system, at least, from the data that Gina and I have seen.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that's the seller side. What about the buyer side, the private equity companies? Why would they be so interested in investing in healthcare?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ariel. And as Lisa kind of highlighted some overall trends initially, healthcare remains a very attractive target for PE investment firms because they're seeking high returns, and it's a critical segment of the economy. Lisa already referenced this $1.8 trillion of capital. In PE lingo, it's referred to as dried powder, which is allocated now for healthcare. There's four main reasons. Healthcare remains a growth sector, and even in an economic downturn, healthcare is relatively recession-proof. I think the two main reasons that they're kind of focusing now on these physician specialties is that they still remain relatively fragmented, and it's a prime opportunity for them to apply their playbook, whereby they're creating value by growing the EBITDA through consolidation and operational efficiencies, and centralizing back office services and so forth. They're driving revenue growth and through their scale and these efficiencies to drive down costs to recapitalization. So these private equity firms, they see ample opportunity still, and they are expecting greater than 20% annual returns by acquiring physician practices.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how it would be kind of a tough decision on the physician side, right? But from the PE side, kind of sounds like a no-brainer. Like, why wouldn't you do it? Can you tell us a bit more about how the private equity ownership landscape has evolved as far as their focus on different specialty areas or geographies or those kinds of things?
Yeah, certainly. So I think you've all seen this map when you logged on. And Lisa referenced a statistic where the ownership is actually flipped. And you'll see previously, private equity really took a top-down approach by buying hospitals and health systems. And you'll see with the map over the last 20 years, they've really kind of switched their focus in terms of private practice acquisition. And it's no coincidence that in the 2016, 2018 period where you see the physicians now being more employed by these private equity and health systems is when the acceleration is actually occurring in the acquisitions. And that's because private equity is looking at more niche markets with a more bottom-up approach to filling in those gaps with these buy and build strategies and less penetrated segments. So in terms of how does private equity go about identifying their strategy for acquisition, they first really kind of hone in on the geography, and they look at a large practice as their platform practice that aligns with their corporate strategy. So some of the things that they are considering, what we found in our research was they look at the strength of the local brand. They're looking at the payer mix of the patients within the practice. They're looking at the overall scope of services. What is the physician fit? Lisa already kind of outlined, why would some physicians want to go work for private equity. And that certainly plays into, what is the cultural fit with acquiring those practices. They're looking at their financials and the assets. In terms of those specialties, you see a list on the side, and I just kind of wanted to point out a couple of the different drivers for some of these specialties. So for instance, with dermatology and ophthalmology, there is a steady stream of procedural revenue and a really good mix of commercial and Medicare reimbursement within their patient mix. And then they also have the added benefit of a cash stream for cosmetic dermatology, as well as retail eyewear in the case of ophthalmology. For the hospital base, and those are more anesthesiology and radiology, when you have out-of-network billing, that really serves as a profit strategy for the private equity. And third, you have gastro and orthopedics. And again, these are more heavy procedural specialties that have those wraparound services for the patient. And it has also a very strong commercial Medicare reimbursement, revenue stream.
What about the impact from COVID? Has that impacted any specific specialties?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We've seen COVID kind of disrupting a lot of the landscape, and I think forward looking, what you can expect to see is perhaps more acquisitions of mental health services, in-home care, as well as telehealth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what about the operating model? When we're thinking about these private equity companies, what kind of operating model are we looking at? You're on mute, Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Ariel. So if you go to the next slide, this is really just building off of, the framework that we showed before of the model. So quite often, what's visible is the group practice and the hospital. And many times what's invisible is that they're part of the same network, because depending on the strategy of the private equity company and the practice management company that they set up, there might be a lot of equity in the practice name or that brand or the brand of the hospital. So they don't change the name. And maybe somewhere in the fine print, when you get your bill or something, you see that it's owned by and part of this practice management network. But in terms of what's visible, it's not always known. And as Gina outlined, depending on the strategy of the private equity company, and we'll get into segmentation in a second in terms of how they tend to have different areas of focus, they do look at this geographically, at least at first. There's much more geographic focus than there is a national focus, and by specialty. And they find a practice that meets all their criteria, and that becomes kind of like their platform practice or their anchor practice. And they build out that practice and hire in new healthcare providers and even acquire additional practices, as you see here where it says new physician practice on the slide. And then you have, employs non-medical staff and merger. Quite often practices are integrated into a big platform practice that can provide, care from preventative treatment to, chronic care management to doing procedures and doing surgery and even critical care and so on. So it really depends on what the strategy is. But again, it goes back to the decisions that are made by that practice management company, and much less so made by the hospitals and the office-based practices.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder, do they have a way to characterize different types of the private equity operating models?
Yeah, so there's many ways you can choose to characterize the types of models. This is a framework that Gina and I have found to be pretty useful in terms of what we usually look at, which is from a marketing standpoint, what strategies might you develop and implement to engage with these practice management companies, and what types of areas of focus and tactics would be those areas of mutual interest. So in this 2x2, we looked at degree of control, which we often look at when we look at large practice networks, and the scope of services. And the differences are really, the higher the degree of control, actually the more attractive that is from an engagement standpoint for a biopharma company, because you can interact with a smaller group of people who control a much larger scope of business and a much larger scope of practices. And those decisions that are made by the practice management organization need to be followed and implemented throughout their practice network. Whereas on the bottom half, in many cases, they just have this collection of practices and they continue to operate very independently. And it's more of the back office stuff that is centralized. And then if you look at the scope of services, sometimes the focus is to just dominate a specialty and really just go deep and just buy up all the practices that are in a particular specialty, like rheumatology or medical dermatology or whatever it might be. And then there are others where they want a much broader scope of services, and they want to be able to be the healthcare delivery system for any kind of healthcare that a patient may need. And they see, again, they're looking at what's the value of an individual patient, and the more services they could provide and the more disease states they could treat, the more revenue that they can generate. So this really starts to affect, how you might approach engaging with these practice management companies once you understand where their focus is and where they may fall on, different variables like this on a continuum.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, I'm guessing that there's probably specific different ways that you should interact or engage with each of these segments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Gina's going to provide some details on that.
Yeah. So in our research, as Lisa mentioned, when we interviewed both from the physician side as well as from the practice management side, we did see clear differences. And I just like to contrast two different examples. So in terms of the lower left-hand quadrant, where they're highly decentralized, they're smaller scale, private equity really hasn't gone in yet to mandate any practice and so forth, and the physicians are still pretty much running their day-to-day operations the way they have. You could still take a very traditional approach, and so that could be you're one-on-one with the reps, engaging with the healthcare provider regarding patient education, or an MSL looking for clinical support, and interacting with the decision maker, which in this case is the healthcare provider. And in contrast, Lisa already mentioned a lot of the different characteristics of the upper right-hand quadrant, which is clinical and economic focus. And this is where private equity has gone in, where they've centralized, their services. They have a wide scope of services and high degree of control. And you may find that you're actually you can engage in a business-to-business manner. So you may find that you are actually engaging with C-suite level individuals who are making the decisions, and they're more centralized in their decision making, and what they decide now impacts a very wide network of practices. And you can do things like initiatives can be based on their electronic health record system, which enables tracking of metrics. So you can get into value-based contracting. You can also, take advantage of their technology platform and to, support some patient engagement initiatives around adherence and retention. We saw an example where you had a branded product that was competing in a generic space, and where application to a patient assistant program could really tip the economics of the brand choice, and having that leverage within the practice management company that mandated application to the patient assistant programs could help, give that brand a competitive advantage.
So I know that we're coming up on time here, so I do apologize. But before we go, Gina, can you just tell us what some of the strategic implications are that biopharma should be considering?
Sure. So I think there's like three main takeaways. First is having knowledge of the PE ownership in your target customer segments. And once you do that, then you can better understand their needs, and allows you to engage more efficiently and more effectively. So contrasting like going to every single physician in a practice versus the C-suite. I think the second part is identifying very specific engagement initiatives that align with the segments and their needs. And you may even then discover, new opportunities for collaboration when you're actually collaborating with this invisible customer, the practice management company, that you may not have otherwise known. And you would be then opened up to initiatives around value-based contracting or patient outcomes and clinical trials. And thirdly, I think developing a customized approach could give you a competitive advantage and also improve patient care.
Awesome. Thank you. So I know we're going a little.
One other thing to what Gina said is that we have seen companies that do have teams now that are customer-facing teams who are engaging with the leaders of these practice management organizations. So they are accessible. You can interact with them. Quite often, this is a combination of a medical discussion as well as a commercial discussion. So it's good to have a combination of people with medical backgrounds as well as people with account management type backgrounds. But it is an area where there's, teams who have been set up who are gaining access to these practice management organization leaders, and they're working on collaborative partnerships and opportunities. So it definitely can be operationalized with teams that are customer facing.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't see any questions that have come in through the Q&A, but if anybody has any questions that they would like addressed by either Lisa or Gina, you can feel free to respond to the email that you'll get after this with the recording, and I can send it along to them. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Lisa and Gina, for putting this presentation together. It was really, really interesting information. I know that I learned a lot. We'll be sending out a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck to everybody through your email. And in the meantime, please check out our SME network, the KMK Star Alliance, at kmkstaralliance.com. And be sure to follow us on social media for information about our upcoming events as well. Lisa and Gina, do you have any final words?
No, I appreciate everybody who joined today and the opportunity to share this information with everyone.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good day.